At the head of the crowd were three women, two of them were remarkably good-looking, and there was nothing strange in so many admirers following after them. But both the admirers and the women, all this was something peculiar, something quite unlike the rest of the public gathered for the music. Nearly everyone noticed them at once, but the greater part tried to pretend that they had not seen them at all, and perhaps only some of the young people smiled at them, commenting to each other in low voices. Not to see them at all was impossible. They made themselves conspicuous, talked loudly, laughed. One might suppose that many of them were drunk, though by the look of it some were smartly and elegantly dressed, but alongside them there were rather strange-looking people, in strange clothes, with strangely inflamed faces. There were several military men among them, not all of them were young, some were dressed comfortably in loose and elegantly made clothes, with signet rings and cuff links, in magnificent, pitch-black wigs and side whiskers, and with a particularly noble, though somewhat squeamish, expression on their faces, the sort of people, however, who are avoided like the plague in society. Among our suburban societies, of course, there are some that are distinguished by an extraordinary decorum and enjoy a particularly good reputation, but even the most cautious person cannot protect himself at every moment against a brick falling from a neighboring house. This brick was now preparing to fall upon the decorous public that had gathered for the music. To pass from the Vauxhall to the green where the orchestra was playing, one had to go down 3 steps. The crowd stopped just at these steps. They did not venture to go down, but one of the women stepped forward. Only 2 of her retinue dared to follow her. One was a rather modest-looking middle-aged man, of decent appearance in all respects, but having the air of a confirmed old bachelor, that is, one of those who never know anybody and whom nobody knows. The other one not to lag behind his lady was a complete ragamuffin of the most ambiguous appearance. No one else followed the eccentric lady, but, going down, she did not even turn to look back, as if it decidedly made no difference to her whether she was followed or not. She laughed and talked as loudly as before. She was dressed extremely tastefully and expensively, but somewhat more magnificently than she ought to have been. She went past the orchestra to the other side of the green, near the road, where somebody's carriage was waiting for someone. The prince had not seen her for more than 3 months. All those days since his arrival in Petersburg, he had been preparing to call on her, but perhaps a secret foreboding had held him back. At least he could in no way anticipate what impression awaited him on meeting her, but sometimes he fearfully tried to imagine it. One thing was clear to him, that the meeting would be painful. Several times during those 6 months he had recalled the first sensation that the face of this woman had produced in him, when he had only seen it in a portrait, but even in the impression of the portrait, he recalled, there was a great deal of pain. That month in the provinces, when he had seen her almost every day, had had a terrible effect on him, so much so that the prince drove away even the memory of that still recent time. For him there was something tormenting in the very face of this woman. The prince, talking with Rogojin, had translated this feeling as one of infinite pity, and that was true. This face, ever since the portrait, had evoked in his heart all the suffering of pity, the impression of compassion and even of suffering for this being never left his heart and had not left it now. Oh, no, it was even stronger. Yet the prince remained dissatisfied with what he had said to Rogojin, and only now, at this moment of her unexpected appearance, did he understand, perhaps through immediate sensation, what had been lacking in his words to Rogojin. Words had been lacking expressive of horror, yes, horror. Now, at this moment, he felt it fully, he was sure, he was fully convinced, for his own special reasons, that this woman was mad. If a man, loving a woman more than anything in the world, or anticipating the possibility of such a love, were suddenly to see her on a chain, behind iron bars, under a warden stick, the impression would be somewhat similar to what the prince was feeling now. What's the matter? Aglaya whispered quickly, glancing at him and naively tugging at his arm. He turned his head to her, looked at her, looked into her dark eyes, whose flashing was incomprehensible to him at that moment, tried to smile at her, but suddenly, as if instantly forgetting her, again turned his eyes to the right and again began to watch his extraordinary apparition. At that moment Nastasia Philippovna was just walking past the young ladies' chairs. Yevgeny Pavlovich went on telling Alexandra Ivanovna something that must have been very funny and interesting, speaking quickly and animatedly. The prince remembered Aglaya suddenly saying in a half-whisper. "What a?" The phrase was uncertain and unfinished. She instantly checked herself and did not add anything more, but that was already enough. Nastasia Philippovna, who was walking along as if not noticing anyone in particular, suddenly turned in their direction, and seemed only now to recognize Yevgeny Pavlovich. "Ha! Here he is!" she exclaimed, suddenly stopping. "First there's no finding him with any messengers, then, as if on purpose, he sits here where you'd never imagine, and I thought you were there, darling, at your uncle's." Yevgeny Pavlovich flushed, looked furiously at Nastasia Philippovna, but quickly turned away again. "What? Don't you know?" "He doesn't know yet, imagine." "He shot himself." "Your uncle shot himself this morning. They told me earlier, at 2 o'clock, half the city knows by now. They say 350,000 in government funds are missing, others say 500,000. And here I was counting on him leaving you an inheritance, he blew it all. A most depraved old fellow he was. Well, goodbye, bon chance. So you really won't go?" "That's why you resigned in good time, smart boy." "Oh, nonsense, you knew beforehand, maybe even yesterday." Though there was certainly some purpose in this impudent pestering, this advertising of an acquaintance and an intimacy that did not exist, and there could now be no doubt of it, Yevgeny Pavlovich had thought first to get rid of her somehow or other, and did his best to ignore the offender. But Nastasia Philippovna's words struck him like a thunderbolt. Hearing of his uncle's death, he went pale as a sheet and turned to the bearer of the news. At that moment Lizaveta Prokofyevna quickly got up from her seat, got everyone up with her, and all but rushed out. Only Prince Lev Nikolaevich stayed where he was for a second, as if undecided, and Yevgeny Pavlovich went on standing there, not having come to his senses. But the Epanchins had not managed to go 20 steps before a frightful scandal broke out. The officer, a great friend of Yevgeny Pavlovich's, who had been talking with Aglaya, was indignant in the highest degree. "Here you simply need a whip, there's no other way with this creature," he said almost aloud. It seems he had been Yevgeny Pavlovich's confidant even before. Nastasia Philippovna instantly turned to him. Her eyes flashed, she rushed to a young man completely unknown to her who was standing 2 steps away and holding a thin, braided riding crop, tore it out of his hand, and struck her offender across the face as hard as she could. All this occurred in a second. The officer, forgetting himself, rushed at her. Nastasia Philippovna's retinue was no longer around her. The decent middle-aged gentleman had already managed to efface himself completely, and the tipsy gentleman stood to one side and guffawed with all his might. In a minute, of course, the police would arrive, but for that minute things would have gone badly for Nastasia Philippovna if unexpected help had not come in time. The prince, who had also stopped 2 paces away, managed to seize the officer by the arms from behind. Pulling his arm free, the officer shoved him hard in the chest. The prince was sent flying about 3 paces and fell on a chair. But by then good luck. 2 more defenders had turned up for Nastasia Philippovna.